Never catch on. No. Here we are. Should we start, Steph? Will we get
Yeah,
going?
I'd say let's get going, yeah.
Okay, so welcome everybody. This is the second now of the new 2021 version of Current, the Zoomcast that we started with. Gosh, it seems a long time ago, but back in September, I think October of last year. The idea being that we're going to have these regular programs where we talk about and around issues relating to architecture. But today, I'm delighted that we're joined by two graduates of UCD of roughly the same vintage, I think. Figured that out along the way. But so Ciana March and Steve Murray both graduated from UCD and have since gone on to in slightly different directions. I think kind of departing from architecture, but kind of staying related to it in terms of how they work and the kind of work they make. I'm not going to go too much into introductions because in a way that what they're going to talk about themselves is a kind of introduction to their work. So we're going to start with Ciana March, and then we're going to go to Steve Murray, and then we'll have a sort of a discussion between us after that, and chance also for questions and comments from the audience, from people who can do that either through chat or just through joining in. So Ciana, maybe we would go to you first, and you're going to talk a little bit about some of the work you've been doing, which is in relation to I would say that I suppose in both instances, I think probably the interests that you've been pursuing since were there while you were studying architecture as well. Interest in fashion, interest in branding, and an interest in how the sort of built environment might connect into those realms. So, Ciana, can we go to you, and maybe you might just say a little bit about some of the work that you've been doing in your since graduating from architecture, which would have been in what year?
2014.
14. Okay.
Yeah. I feel like you've already done a much better job than I will, Hugh, saying it so eloquently. But yeah, I started architecture in 2007 and finished in 2014. So it took a bit of a longer route, took a gap year. And kind of about halfway through, I was like, I don't know if I've gotten the calling, that some other people seem to have gotten, or I felt it took me a bit longer to really get what it was I was really meant to be doing in the course. And I think it was around fourth year, fourth year that I kind of got it, and I started to understand where my strengths lay, and that was, I felt very much in the kind of conceptual side of it. So when the project was more conceptual as opposed to how it was built, and I really kind of excelled at that side of things. And I suppose the visualization of the designs I was working on was always a big kind of interest to me. And it was around that time that I started a blog with my best friend and fellow UC graduate, Becky Wallace, which looked at, I suppose, the cross-pollination of fashion and architecture. And initially it was very much just Becky and I, running around places of architectural interest in Dublin at the weekend and photographing each other, wearing normally young designer collections. And that really kind of, I always had an interest in fashion, but it really kind of kickstarted that world of like image making and that kind of thing. So, so this is like an early image that we would have done. It was in collaboration with COS, and it was taken by Becky at the Smiljan, I never say his name correctly, but Smiljan Radic Serpentine Pavilion in London. We actually met the architect on the day, which was amazing. But just to give you an early, like a sense of what we were kind of doing at the time. And I suppose our tutors were aware that we were doing this and maybe a bit, a bit kind of concerned that we were getting a bit distracted by this side project. But I suppose it was worth it in the end. This was taken at the Bagot Street Bank, Scott Town Walker. But Becky and I weren't very comfortable in front of the camera, so soon we kind of realized we wanted to be behind it instead. And it was in my final year when it came to writing a dissertation, and Hugh was my dissertation tutor, and kind of really dragged out of me what it is I was really interested in, and wanted to speak about. And it was this world of, I suppose, branding and anti-branding, and looking at how, I suppose, I drew a parallel between 6A architects and designer Maison Martin Margiela, and how they had created these worlds that was very distinctly them, but was also very kind of anonymous. So this was the book that I made to bind my dissertation together. And yeah, I suppose, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. So I kind of realized, through this journey of fashion and architecture, that my granddad, who was an architect, had also been kind of exploring these ideas through his own work. And he had designed this suit back in the 80s called the Rationale suit, which folded down into a series of squares. He actually wore this to a dinner, but I've since acquired it now and have been meaning to photograph it, but it was interesting to see that it was kind of in my blood. And yeah, so I suppose then 2014 I graduated from architecture, a bit jaded, I suppose, a bit, obviously just kind of wanted to take somewhat of a break from the discipline and go into this world of image making, and had started an internship with Makers and Brothers, which was a really incredible craft and design business in Ireland. And those years were very formative for me. Or those few months, I suppose it was only 6 months, but they were very formative. It kind of gave me an insight into the world of design beyond architecture. So looking at product design and craft, and really getting closer into the making process, and I suppose again image and filmmaking. So these are just some screenshots from a stop motion film that I directed at the time for them. And then I started a job then, which was for a brand consultancy who worked with costs. And so it was very much, again, working with people who had this kind of, I suppose, interest in branding and architecture and bringing those two worlds together. And it was alongside that work that Becky and I continued this project, Concrete Collar, and we were commissioned by Open House Dublin and Open House Cork to create, I suppose, a series of images using buildings from their programs. So yeah, we had great kind of access to all sorts of spaces. So these are some of those images taken back then. This is the Lake House in Howth, and the Dublin Port Centre in Dublin, obviously. And this was the Open House Cork project. So this is a beautiful kind of brutalist church in Cork, and Black Mars CIT. And I suppose it was after that kind of brand consultancy job that I decided to go freelance, and to focus more on, I suppose, my own practice and work as a stylist and an art director. And a lot of something that's quite important when you're freelancing is to develop your own personal work, work that's not necessarily commissioned, but that's something that really shows what you're about as a creative. And so this project, Facades, the idea was sparked. It was published by the Irish Times along with an article, but the idea came about after I attended the Docomomo AGM in 2017, I'm going to say, and there was 3 kind of noteworthy buildings at the time that were under threat of demolition. Fitzwilton House on the canal there, the Board Fáilte HQ by Ronald Walker, sorry, Robin Walker, and then Andrew Devan's bank, AIB Bank in Ballsbridge. And actually all of the buildings featured in this shoot have since been demolished, quite sadly. But this story was, I suppose, trying to speak about the issue in a way that was maybe more accessible to the general public. I mean, obviously, I didn't succeed in winning over the demolishers, but it created a nice set of images anyway. This is actually Alicia Quinn, who's an architect who graduated at the same time as us. But yeah, it was very much about, you know, highlighting underappreciated elements of brutalist and modernist architecture that's often quite, you know, seen by people as, you know, unsightly, and trying to highlight those the materiality of them, and the depth and that sort of thing. And yeah, I suppose another personal project which was which happened around the time was this called Denim, and it was, I suppose I've included this because it really speaks to, I suppose, the sense of place that I think comes through in my work. So just a lot of my work is, you know, location based, like rarely in a studio, and I suppose it's quite documentary as well. So very much about the people and the place, and how it informs, you know, how people dress and inhabit spaces and that kind of thing. And so this was a series which featured a rare vintage denim collection which is in the west of Ireland, and we shot it on people who are from this area, and people who work with their hands and work with the sea, and it spoke to kind of the history of workwear of denim. And I suppose more recently, you know, Concrete Collar has continued as a project of ours throughout the years, and it's very much, you know, still informs the work that I do with my clients. And this was a project that was commissioned by the Dublin Port Centre and Open House Dublin in 2019, and we brought together a young Irish fashion designer called Andrew Bell and an Irish artist called Ali Kirby, and we created this, so this quite multidisciplinary one-day installation which was open to the public, and we worked with another UCD graduate, Gareth Smith, on a soundscape for it, and then with a contemporary dancer on the movement. So it was very much about responding to the space, which is the Dublin Port Centre, the foyer of the Dublin Port Centre, and responding to it through sound and movement in a way that we hope the public would kind of engage with. So these are some images from that event. Am I okay for time?
Yeah, good. Yeah.
Okay, great. So the sculptural pieces very much, I've responded to the architecture through the office blinds, and the door, this kind of wedge shape was about like the I suppose the delivery and kind of, you know, shipping side of the Dublin Port Centre, and then, you know, also kind of spoke to Andrew Bell's collection. He's a Royal College of Art graduate. So yeah, that was kind of a great kind of project. It was really one of those commissions where we kind of had full reign, and, you know, had a brilliant team. And I suppose that's very much a part of being an art director, is you know, bringing together the right people. There's a lot of project management involved in it, but there's obviously, you know, the curation and the more like aesthetic side of it. So it's very much trying to pick the right people for the jobs and hope that there's a kind of a harmonious team that makes the project work. So yeah, kind of thanks to the pandemic, we finally had a chance to relaunch our website Concrete Collar, which in the early days was a very kind of crude blog spot. And yeah, so we're still kind of working on that. It explores, I suppose, the people, project, place, and things that inform our work. So we interview like-minded, artists or sculptors or art directors, and it also, is a space for us to speak about the spaces that we've and buildings that we visit, and that might inform our work further down the line. So this is just a look at the website, which we worked with the developer on, which kind of brings in like a bold use of color. And this is a very cheeky quote that Andrew Devon said to Frank Lloyd Wright, which you can't imagine writing now. And a visit to Turn End. So do take a look. You might find some interesting things there. Yeah, and I suppose so. I recently moved to London and was, got this great job here, and then was subsequently furloughed for most of 2020. But it allowed me to reconnect with some of the art designers that I'd met kind of earlier on in my career. And one of them is a knitwear designer called Roz Duke. And from London, I worked with her to direct a campaign which was very much about the place that informs most of her work, which is White Rock Beach in Killiney. And it was a series of images and and a film, and also a newspaper which spoke about, I suppose, the texture that of the metamorphic rocks on the beach, and how that weaves into the textiles that she makes. So these are some of those stills. And I suppose it was about, in a time when we couldn't use models because of restrictions, it was about how you could bring a garment to life and give it some type of personality. So the garments look as if they're, I suppose, bathing in the sunlight. And I suppose lastly is a project which I just recently finished, the Snow project, which I worked with. I'm working with I do some consultancy with a photography company in Ireland called Stills in Motion. And, coming up, I suppose it was around October, one of the photographers had this body of work that had never really been seen, but that was really beautiful, and it was of empty snugs, in pubs in Ireland, and he'd taken them 10 years ago. And I thought it kind of felt like a really fitting time to do something with these images, given that so many pubs had been closed throughout 2020 and were likely, some of them, never to open again. So I had this idea to do a calendar, and we got a team of people together. It was a charity project, A Native Alone, which is a charity that works with older people. And we got an incredible team of people together to design and promote and print this calendar. And thankfully it was a great success in the end, and we've raised about €20,000 altogether between the calendar sales and the print sales. So this is just a look at some of these images. It's beautifully designed by a graphic designer called Paul Guinan, who's Dublin based. And these are some of the pages. So that's the final.
That brings us to 2021.
Yes. Ta-da!
So how's your 2021 looking? That's what this last image invites that question.
Yeah. Empty.
Empty, okay. No snugs for a while yet.
Yes.
This is great. Is that, Ciana, is that still, because I know that was, you were promoting that and selling the calendars and so on. Is that still running, or is it now?
It's finished now. Yeah, we finished just at the end of January. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Keena. That was great. That was really interesting and um, varied, but also kind of coherent. I mean, in other words, there's something that feels like everything you did naturally flowed one from the next. There was a sort of path. But
Mm.
I'm just wondering if it felt like that, or if you sort of had a feeling of where it was you were trying to go, or if things emerged.
Yeah, I definitely not lost my way, but at times when I was freelancing, kind of started going down routes, and you accept projects, or you're asked to do projects, and you kind of have to say, well, at the time it feels like you have to say yes because it's money and that kind of thing, um and there are things that now, projects that I did back in the day that I wouldn't, I know now that it wasn't, the right kind of thing for me. So yeah, there was definitely a lot of, like, a big learning curve when I first went freelancing. There was a couple of years there. um but recently, yeah, I've definitely kind of, been able to hone what it is I'm interested in, and had more of a luxury of picking and choosing. But I think you have to make those mistakes along the way. Um,
You keep, at a certain point, you described your, oh, or maybe indirectly described yourself as an art director.
mm,
And is that, if forced, is that now the label that you would ascribe to yourself, or is there a need for one? Or you know what I mean? I'm just wondering.
yeah, I think since moving to London, I've said, I say art director because it is, depending who you're speaking to, it's quite an all-encompassing term, and for one person it can mean one thing, and for another it could mean you're a graphic designer, which I'm not.
Yeah.
um so it does help to, I suppose, put some sort of shape in it, but there definitely are other kind of elements to my work that I find it hard to fit into that box. um and I think sometimes I can be a bit afraid of those, having a couple of different labels, because you think people are kind of like, I don't really know who you are. Do you do this or do you do that? But it's also about kind of trying to embrace that it's okay to be, to have a couple of different things that you do.
And
uh,
presumably you also want to stay open to doing different kind of things or moving in slightly different directions. Like you don't want to be confined by the.
yeah, exactly. I kind of, there's a part of my work, I do copywriting. I really enjoy writing, and not a lot of art directors would have that side of their work, so that can kind of throw people. So but I'm embracing it more of late.
It strikes me that a lot of it is about orchestrating, orchestrating different elements, different aspects, bringing things together, bringing
Mm,
photographer, graphic designer, I mean, in a very simple way, different kinds of uh, people with different skills, but also a place and an idea, or a place and
yeah.
garden, whatever it might be. And I'm just wondering if it's, in my mind, that maybe relates back to your training in architecture.
Mm.
I wonder if you see it that way, that kind of skill of sort of synthesizing or bringing together.
I think so, like, definitely. I think my background in architecture has given me such a good grounding in, I think as an architect you have to be a master of many things, and um, and and it also gives you a very good kind of ability at critical thinking, and really analyzing your work and questioning what it is you're doing, and why you're doing it. And I think it's that level of discipline that has really fed into what I do. Yeah.
Mm. Mm. I have um, well, probably lots more questions, but just also wanted to ask if people do have questions. I think what we'll do is maybe just, we might have a couple more minutes, and then I might go to Steve, and then we'll come back together at the end, and we can also talk about the both of what both of you are doing
Mm.
together. If for now, if there's immediate questions that people wanted to ask Ciana, or comments, if you might put them in the chat or just unmute. Because so, Ciana, you're now based in London, and I guess the pandemic shifted your where you thought you were going to be as opposed to where you are.
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah, it's a very funny time to have moved. We moved over at the end of 2019 and had like 5 months of non-pandemic, and then and then got plunged into it. So it is, yeah, it's a funny time to be here, definitely. But I think good things came from, you know, having to pause and reflect on your work and see, and really kind of look at the trajectory that, you know, that you're going down.
And something you mentioned as well about early on, you were sort of saying how important it was to develop your own, let's say, voice, or to articulate your own voice, aesthetic interests, maybe even conceptual, where you sit conceptually, and that you need to do that in order so that people know who you are
Mm.
and come to you. So presumably in your work, there's always this balance between work that you're doing to develop your own, let's say, sensibilities, interests, and then work that comes out of that that's more commercial.
Yeah, and you know, it's something I speak about a lot with other people who, you know, are working for themselves, that um, the importance of doing, you know, personal projects, um, like non-commissioned work, and getting your work seen. And then I suppose it's to position yourself. And you know, there's I think every single you know, art director, photographer has work that they would never want anyone to see, and it's it's just work that kind of gets buried.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure there's an equivalent with architecture as well. But yeah, you, I suppose, keeping on coming back to these, you know, returning to these kind of projects that, you know, and I suppose every time you present your portfolio, you are presenting a selected view of your work,
Mm.
to help tell a story or find a thread between various projects. Yeah.
But I mean, would you envisage that there's a point at which those two streams, let's say, merge in the sense that your own personal modus operandi, your vision, is able to sit comfortably in the work that you're doing commercially?
Yeah, and it's definitely happening more. Yeah, more so of late, definitely. And I think it probably comes from, you know, just having a better sense of, um, or just pursuing the people you want to work with that feel like the right people, you know, like a good match for me, and rather than always waiting for them to come to you. And um, and then, yeah, again, having the confidence to say no to something if it's not quite right. Yeah.
And just one final question that's just on my mind as well is this: something about what's implicit and explicit in terms of what comes out of the work, because there's certain things you talked about. Say you're talking about those three buildings now demolished that you're wanting as a backdrop for, you know, but
Mm.
ostensibly about something else for the purposes of the purpose it serves is to highlight,
Mm.
you know, certain designers, but the other purpose it's kind of secretly serving is maybe um, to point to these kind of architecture backdrops.
Mm.
Is that again a conscious strategy, that like of kind of the message that's overt, and then the messages that are uh, less so, that are more covert?
Um, yeah, I suppose so. You know, through, like, if the Roz Duke project, for example, you know, it's the project was about promoting her knitwear, but really when it came down to it, the photographer and I just wanted to take some really nice images, you know. And it's lovely that the jumpers are there and the sweaters are there, and obviously the images wouldn't be the same without them, but it kind of just becomes about, yeah, wanting to, you know, get a series of strong images together.
Yeah.
um
Yeah.
yeah.
So it's as much as the purpose.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Um, Ciana, can we? I'm going to go to Steve now, and then
Mhm.
bring maybe you to talk about your work. Thank you very much. That was really, really interesting, and I think I'm
Thanks.
sure there's questions, and I think people are very interested in the work that you're doing. But Steve, can we come to you now? And I know you're going to talk about one project in particular, but just to introduce Steve, also a graduate of UCD, and also has moved on to, I think, related activities on the one hand in theatre, in acting and directing, right? But also in photography. Um, Maybe the label architectural photography doesn't sit. I don't know. We'll see how well it sits with you, Steve. But that certainly you have photographed a lot of architecture. Um, so, Steve, it'd be great if you could share your screen and maybe talk to us a bit about what you've been up to. You're muted at the moment.
Of course I am. Now I'm not. Hi. Thanks, Hugh. Thanks for that. I'm just going to share this here and just say thanks for that introduction. I tempted to just quit there and quit while I'm ahead. But let's see if we get on. Thanks as well to Alice and Owen and to Steph for all the organising and for having me on. And hello to everyone tuning in. Hope you're all well and taking care. And great to see Ciana's work there. As you said so concisely put together. I was wondering how you're going to do it, Ciana, everything that you've been up to over the last few years, to try and put that in a concise format. So I'll do my best to keep up standards. I'm going to try to talk about a photographic project of mine, which will hopefully, as you said, serve as a bit of a basis for some spin-offs and give us a chance to look at what I do a bit more generally. I'm going to jump straight in by actually jumping straight out very far away to the scale of the cosmos, if you'll bear with me for a second. And this image, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is known as the pale blue dot and was taken 31 years ago, this week actually, on Valentine's Day in 1990, when the spacecraft Voyager 1, which was approximately 6 billion kilometers away, swung back its lens towards the sun to make this first ever family portrait of our solar system. And I find myself coming back to this image a lot, both from a professional and a kind of personal point of view. And anyone who's seen the wonderful documentary The Farthest will understand its significance. And in that, it was Carl Sagan who convinced NASA to turn the camera back on ourselves. And it was Carl Sagan who also poetically said that the totality of human accomplishment, everything we've ever wished and done, has played out on that barely visible speck. And just to continue the Valentine's theme, he also said, for small creatures such as we, the vastness is bearable only through love. And that's quite nice, isn't it? And that vastness, I guess, as a freelancer can kind of feel difficult to chart a course through sometimes. I'm sure Ciana will agree. It's difficult sometimes to kind of see where your destination might be. But one thing that struck me since my time in UCD is to try focus on the doing. And I know it's harped on about a lot, but to focus on the process and not just the product. Now, Voyager 1 was no stranger to taking these photos. It took these incredible images 10 years previously on its encounter with Saturn. I think they're class, and I think they bear this uncanny resemblance to the record, which of course it was carrying on board, the golden record. And that record and the cameras that took those photos all, as Carl Sagan reminds us, all came from this planet, which I'm sure some of you might recognize. But I can guarantee that most, if not all of us here today, have only seen this view in photographs. That's a very select few people have experienced what's known as the overview effect. That idea that you only truly appreciate where you've come from once you get there and look back. Just like Voyager looked back on its way out of the solar system, and just like I'm looking back on my practice today, grateful for the origins. So my friends are always kind of and anyone tuning in will know that my friends are always giving me stick for trying to explain things in using analogies. But here we are. So I find it sometimes helpful to see the various things that I do as kind of separate planets, which are all almost orbiting around and coexisting in my own little small solar system. And yes, it can be exhausting flying from planet to planet and the moons of those planets. And yes, sometimes there's near misses, but with the help of the overview effect, that is to say, seeing the bigger picture, I'm able to start to see the links between these different trajectories and ultimately, hopefully, enjoy lots of little voyages around my own little sun. I was going to use the analogy of spinning plates, but I think the solar system's a bit cooler. So just to jump into it, I'm conscious of this becoming a kind of a portfolio parade, but just to give you a quick idea, I work with architects to document their projects, and sometimes those projects are cultural buildings. Sometimes they are residential. Sometimes the projects are larger public pieces. or sometimes they're temporary. I also work with arts organizations on their events. You get this nice mix between people and place. And then beside that, I work with theatre makers and musicians and all sorts of other makers to document their work. I also work as an actor myself on stage and on screen when I can. I seem to like wearing hats. And I dabble in the space dust that is filmmaking and graphic design as well. And of course, sometimes this can feel like I'm that character from Catherine Tate who says, yeah, I can do that to almost everything. And then she soon realizes the hard way that she probably can't do that. But I'm working on getting better at focusing and refining. So that is to say that my work is mainly commissioned, and you touched on it there, Hugh, as a kind of a commercial photographer. I'm conscious of those words, but I guess they can be the best way to describe that work we've just seen. So I'm usually hired by these other makers to document their work. And there's always an element of collaboration involved, but there's a kind of inherent contract or agreement from the outset, in the sense that I'm brought on board to respond to and interpret their work. So there's a kind of a hierarchy or endorsement that's always in place. And then even working as an actor, there's kind of a duty to interrogate or ultimately serve the text or the piece. You're there to help to tell a story. So I wanted to find even more stories. And the closest I've come to my own kind of overview effect, at least a version of that effect, tends to happen on my own much smaller voyages abroad. Here's where I kind of get to hunt down personal projects like Ciana was talking about, and where I can set and follow my own brief, which has led to a kind of a different kind of validation. So these trips are often last minute and tend to take advantage of gaps in schedule. So in the case of this visit to Sicily in 2018, it was just after Open House weekend, which is one of my busiest weekends of the year. And I think a week before I started rehearsal for a one-man show. So there's kind of a window of opportunity. And by the way, I'm completely aware that talking about holidays and trips abroad is extremely cruel given the current situation, but don't worry, I'm feeling it too. So the main project I want to talk about is this. It's the Grande Cretto, also known as the Cretto di Burri or the Cretto di Ghibellina. And I won't even attempt to pronounce anything Italian here today, even though my dad did discover last year that he's something like 12% Italian, which makes me something like 6% Italian. And so who knows, maybe I'll manage to get 6% of the pronunciations correct. For anyone unfamiliar with it, Sicily is the thing that Italy is kicking. And the Belize Valley is where the earthquake of 1968 hit. And the valley is south of Palermo. And the Cretto is at Ghibellina there. So that's Palermo at the top. And these three markers are what we're going to talk about today. The one in the middle is the Cretto. And just take note of the other two, and I'll be touching on them hopefully if I have time. So this is it from above, which of course no one really sees unless you're a pilot or an astronaut. That's a little callback for those down the back. This is the view from the bus as you arrive, and it's basically a landscape artwork by the sculptor and multi-materialist Alberto Burri, undertaken in 1984. So it's 16 years after the earthquake. And this is what you're greeted with when you get dropped off, which is about kind of a fifth of the way, 1/5 of the way up the hill that it sits on. And these walls range in heights, but are about 1.5 meters high on average, meaning you can kind of poke your head over them and get a glimpse of this kind of patchwork pattern. This image here should give you an idea of the scale of it, if you can see that guy there at the top right. And you kind of have this, there is a temptation to go straight up, especially when you have this kind of passive observation that's happening, where you're looking up at people looking down on you. But I went down a little bit first, and I was kind of interested in how this starts to line up with the surrounding landscape. I was curious what happened at the edge of this thing. Like it must end somewhere, and how does that end manifest itself? And I guess because it's so minimal, it kind of allows you as a viewer, experiencer, a lot of space to start to find links and connections. So the pathways in the concrete start to draw my attention to the lines in the surrounding landscape and the agriculture, or the lines left by an airplane above. And so you make your way up and you start to feel the gradient beneath you increasing. And you get these strange juxtapositions with objects nearby. Maybe it's a church on the horizon, or wind turbines on the hill. And you've got this kind of strange consciousness of time where past and future are on the horizon, and you're in the middle of navigating this kind of liminal space. It should be said that the whole thing is south-facing, so on a sunny day, you're practically blinded as you make your way up. And then there's this sense, I guess, of achievement of sorts as you reach the top, with incredible views of the valley around. But all the while, and this is what I'm trying to get at, there's this consciousness that beneath you lies the ruins of a town. And that's a town where 400 people died and about 100,000 were displaced in the valley, I should say. So that was the second stop on this 3-stop tour. I'll just fly through basically the first stop we went to was this town of Poggio Reale. And I'll just fly through these because I'm conscious of time, but basically you're outside and you wait for someone to come and unlock the town, basically unlock the gates. It's all propped up, fenced off, and it's essentially a ghost town. You can poke your head into kind of various archways, and you can see people's homes, and this is a classroom. I think a lot of things are actually filmed there, and it's quite scenic in that sense. Reminds me a bit like a Western or something. I'm not sure if it's the windows. We made a few friends along the way as well. And as you leave, there's this kind of mini museum, almost exit through the gift shop kind of feel, which has all these found possessions, kind of mementos in the memorial. So that was the first stop. Decreto's the second stop, as you've seen. And the third stop down I just want to touch on is the visit to the new town. So it was a planned town built about 10 years after the earthquake, and the plan resembles a butterfly shape, but I guess it's unfinished in this regard, and it's pretty much deserted. It's described as a cemetery of the avant-garde. Put simply, there was no employment for the young people, so they all left. So what we're left with is this kind of outdoor museum of sorts with lots of art pieces and experiments in the built form. And it's hard not to equate these large concrete walls to the ones we've experienced earlier that day. And similarly to the Decreto, you can climb the hill and get up to this church, which has this concave shape, which of course forms this space on the rear. And a very strange moment in the middle of the town is when there's this map of the Decreto itself, almost like a constant reminder to these residents of what their old town and their old lives have become. So it's kind of its own memento, a constant reminder. And just to return to the Decreto briefly, just to say that the reason I wanted to talk about this today, and my kind of key point here that I'm trying to get at is this was one of the first projects, I guess, for me that felt like I was critically engaging with the work. So none of the kind of endorsement that comes with a lot of commissioned work, the camera there was no kind of selling or advertising. The camera kind of felt like a tool for thinking and for representing some of my thoughts in the place. So you see some of the walkways are kind of fenced off, and you start to spot these hose pipes that are running around the place. And these are basically leading up to a water tank at the top, which is used by the workers to repair the cracks in this monolith. So it's kind of this never-ending replastering over the history and over the cracks. And Decreto literally means cracks, but I don't think these are the kind of cracks that Alberto Burri had in mind. And the overriding feeling when you wander around these fissures is a feeling of tragedy and solemnity. In one way, it is, I think, a very powerful art piece about remembering and about moving on. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the rubble from people's homes is what they used as the aggregate, and the paths that you wander through are cracks in concrete, which is encasing the physical traces of people who called this place home. And I'm sure there's many of you here today who will see this as absolutely chaotic in terms of conservation and very anarchic in terms of archaeology. And just one final thing, if I have 2 minutes, if that's okay, is just to say that the day before this trip to these 3 towns, I visited the regional gallery in Palermo. And the intention really was just to see the spaces and this staircase designed by one Carlo Scarpa, which of course you can't climb because that would be too much fun. And so the focal point of this museum is this impressive fresco entitled The Triumph of Death. And you can also view it from the balcony above. I thought that was a really nice move. So it gives it this kind of drama and double experience, I guess, from 2 levels, and just really emphasizes the drama of the piece. And so thematically, it's a memento mori, or reminder of death, which of course was quite a common theme in the 15th century due to the Black Plague, which I didn't know but arrived to Europe through Sicily. So no wonder Italy is giving it a kick. But there's a particular emphasis here on the grotesque and the macabre, which I guess we don't normally associate, or I personally don't associate a lot with Italian art, which you normally think would be more romantic or elegant, I suppose. So we have Death, just to run through it real quickly, we have Death entering on his skeletal horse, and his ribs are showing, and he's got an emancipated head, and he's firing arrows from a bow at these characters from all social classes. And down here you've got the corpses of people previously killed, emperors, popes, bishops, friars, poets, knights, maidens. Some of them are grimacing, and some of them are quite serene. And then there's a group of poor people over here asking them to please stop what you're doing, but they're being ignored. And there's a group of fancy nobles over this side, which are shown as having no interest in the whole thing. Most of them are just continuing on with their activities. And I think I've seen a few people like that over on Twitter recently. So just to say that the next day while visiting the ghost town, the Creto, and then the new town, I think I was carrying this imagery in my mind and carrying this kind of unsettling feeling in my stomach, which kind of framed the whole visit through this landscape of trauma, haunting me as I journeyed through the cracks. And just to finish up by saying that, we encounter these places and these pieces and we feel something. These artworks are trying to speak to us about the fragility and the temporality of life. They could be talking about a great plague or a sudden earthquake. And to us, these events can feel like big, distant, impossible things. But I think one thing we can take from the past year is that we simply must go on and learning from all this, learning from this part of the process with even more compassion, sensitivity, and empathy. We don't have too much control over our orbits around the sun. It can be hard to shake these trajectories off course. But we can relish the journey and the voyage, leaving our legacy behind us and tracing into the sand the words, "Yes, I was here." And that's where I stop talking. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you for that beautifully orchestrated journey. In response to a pretty open invitation, great to get something sort of fully formed. And I guess, lots of questions maybe specifically about this project, but also more generally about your own trajectory. Maybe firstly, just to wonder what brought you to this place. Was this a journey that you planned specifically? You knew what you were looking for, or was it more accidental?
This one was definitely more accidental. I didn't know about the Creto at all, or even about the earthquake or anything. So it was kind of, I think I was going through a phase of just trying to take these opportunities to get away. And while I was there, kind of sniffing around for projects. And that's what I'm saying about the orbits around the sun. It's like once you know what you're kind of interested in and what catches your eye, then you're drawn towards certain things.
Mm. So things begin to happen for you. Things start to make sense for you. And the way in which you pulled it together there with reference back to the fresco and so on, was that again something that you were post-rationalizing, or was that something that was emerging as you were there, if you like, or clarifying itself as you were there?
That's definitely looking back in the photos, I realized that I think that was definitely, I was carrying that around with me. I guess it's not every fresco that you get enamored with, but I do remember feeling quite drawn to that, and spending a lot of time in that nave, and going back up to the balcony and back down again to look at it a few times and reading the description over and over.
I like your note of caution there. It's not every fresco I get enamored with.
yeah. So
I think that's true for us all, though, Steve.
Yeah, it's a common misconception about frescoes. Yeah.
But that was clearly a good one.
Yeah, I think it stuck with me. I think, and but it's not really until you have to then pull things together, and you go back to your photos, which are scattered between hard drives and phones and iClouds and Dropboxes and all sorts of stuff, and you kind of pull everything together, and you start to see these connections, I guess. But I definitely do remember feeling moved. It's just whether I was conscious of it while walking around the Creto. I think I was more subconscious of it than conscious, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Can I just again to invite, if people have questions, either put up your hand and Steph can unmute you, or just go into the chat, or comments, or anything that people want to say. I know we're up towards 2:00, but we might just keep going for about 5 or 10 more minutes if that's possible with everybody. I think it would be nice to do. And Steve, I know a number of things you said in as you were talking about the way you work, and maybe with a project like this, I'm just thinking back to Ciana and this idea of developing your own personal move, and kind of developing your own interests and trying to make projects that refine your sensibility. And I presume that this project is doing that kind of work for you, and you're kind of mixing it with commercial in that same manner. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, literally, I only put my personal projects up on my website, I think, a year or two ago, because I guess there's a different type of liberation or validation that comes with them, and usually that validation is in the form of a gallery or a publisher, or even an online publisher. You have to kind of just take stock of why you like them, I think. And I think it was a big move for me putting them up on the website, because it was me saying, look, this is what I'm interested in, and if even if you want to commission me, then there might be similar themes here that we can look at. So that's why I said I'm conscious about terms and about terminology, because your commissioned work can be deeply personal, and you can bring a lot of personality to your commissioned work or your commercial work. Also, your commercial work can be unpaid. You could take on a project on spec. So like the Dundee and the Kengo Kuma, was done on spec, where I basically went over and we shot it over 2 days, and then retrospectively earned money, and it became a portfolio piece and a profitable piece.
And so that's the same, presumably. Actually, it's funny that both Open House, which I know, and Serpentine Pavilions featured in both your talks. So it's the same, presumably, with the Francis Carré or pavilions you would go to. You're going on spec, making photographs, and then hoping they get picked up.
Yeah, it's not an ideal way to work, but it's nice to get those opportunities, I think, to come in to encounter those kind of pieces.
Yeah. I mean, again, just a question to you, Steve, that I was asking Ciana, like whether it's like maybe a two-part question. First of all, whether that journey, having graduated from architecture, was kind of clear to you that that's the direction you wanted to go, directions, or it just happened and you began to make sense of it as you went along. And then secondly, how the extent to which your training in architecture has been, let's say, instrumental or helpful in you doing what you do now.
Yeah, I think it kind of boils down to that thing of not knowing the destination, but you always definitely know the origin. Like, that's a certainty. So we all know that we've come from architecture, and that that kind of forms a groundwork to a lot of things. So if something maybe feels like Ciana said there, the thread, and feels like it's becoming loose, there's a way of kind of tautening it, because you know what your foundations or what your main interest or training, I guess, is in. That might sound a bit loose, but I guess no, you never really know the destination. I don't personally know. Really, I don't have a big master plan or anything. I think it's just about trying things. That's certainly what's worked for me. And of course, there's days where I wish I just did one thing and had more time for that, or could go deeper into just one very specific subject. But I guess the journey I've chosen is kind of this fragmented these multiple orbits, as I said. Yeah.
I see we're just getting in the chat there a nice linking of the two. There's a fashion shoot. I don't have time to look at it now, but just if people are interested, there's a fashion shoot. Vivian Sasson shooting in that in the Creto in 2016. That might be it. That's why bringing the two together. And see, just then, like as you're going through that sort of work, do you find yourself having recourse back to things you learned in architecture school, if I can put it like that? Like either it's this stuff about being able to organize and synthesize, or actually it's the spatial sensibility, which strikes me as being very important to your work.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of everything. And as we said earlier, Ciana was saying, you do come out as a bit of a jack of all trades. And I think it's being able to touch on, so for example, this project, being able to touch on the historical side of things, the political side of things, and the physical, the material, the spatial, and there's all these kind of different elements that you're kind of juggling. So hopefully they can manifest themselves into imagery. And that's kind of what I'm coming back to, this idea of you are here, and you're the only you that is here, and that will ever be here. And there's a certain liberation in that, because yes, I graduated with 50 or 60 in the year, and that there's 50 or 60 people graduating every year from UCD architecture, and there's hundreds of people graduating from architecture in Ireland, and there's thousands of people graduating from architecture around the world, but each person has a different path or journey before that and after that. So because of those, it's naturally going to be different. You're naturally going to see things differently. But certainly, just to kind of root it back into what you're saying, like definitely come back to ways of working or trusting the process, thinking of things as almost like butter paper or sketches, and thinking of the process as opposed to this is how my project is going to look on my final pinup. And also being able to take criticism, I think, is really useful, especially as an actor. If you ever have to read a bad review, you can hopefully take it as if it's constructive. You can hopefully take that into your work. It's easier said than done, of course.
Very practical question from a very recent graduate, Paul Weedle, to both of you, asking about how do you start to acquire work, which I think is a very important question. I mean, you might be all set, ready to go, and nobody's calling. Ciana,
Ciana, do you want to go take that?
I think it's something you learn and like continue to learn, and I think at the beginning, I definitely, it wasn't so much cold calling, it was people I had worked with in some capacity before and who I admired, that I would reach out to, and that led, very early days led to commissioned work, but not necessarily paid work. And then, and I think as you go on, you kind of maybe get a better sense of who you might work well with. And so when you're contacting people or reaching out to people, it's a bit more targeted and deliberate, and you're coming at them with a specific project in mind, or with a kind of well pieced together portfolio that works for them. And also I suppose I think initially Concrete Collar actually had a lot to do with the work that my early freelance work, and I think that was to do with it. It did get some press at the beginning, just through various blogs and magazines and that kind of thing, and it definitely, again, it was a personal project that spoke to people, or that was on people's radars, and I think that that definitely helped. Yeah.
Steve?
Yeah, I think it's always easy. I can understand how maybe people starting off can look at you and think that you've got everything set and you're comfortable, but I think it's about never being comfortable. And I think no matter what stage you're at, you're constantly looking for new collaborations and new projects to work on. But of course, and it's a great question, Paul, I guess for myself starting off, I was very lucky that I had a great network of people around me. So I was very involved in the Drama Society in UCD, and a lot of people there went on to, because they finished slightly before our longer architecture course, they would have gone on to start making plays and shows in Dublin. Or friends that were musicians would need photos, or friends that maybe, I mean, I graduated in 2012, so you have to imagine that there wasn't a lot of building going on, and so a lot of friends would have started kind of would have had like pop-up exhibitions, and would have done a lot of kind of things like that where they needed photographs. And luckily, because we'd been kind of dabbling and experimenting with this stuff in college, either in Dramsoc or just on side projects all along, I was luckily I was their go-to guy. And so it kind of just develops from there. And then you start to, as they progress, you progress with them, and then you get recommended, and then the portfolio starts to hopefully speak for itself. But it's a constant process of searching and never being comfortable.
Funny, I'd kind of I hadn't forgotten, obviously, but I kind of hadn't remembered fully, like the 2012, 2014, the existence of, I mean, there weren't that many opportunities around. One had to make things of oneself to a certain extent. And it just strikes me that people do tend to come out and start off on their own paths when there are not set options available to you easily. You can't just come out and join a practice. There's not that many jobs around.
Yeah.
I assume that's kind of part of it, what opportunities there are. Yeah. And having to make things up for yourself.
Definitely, yeah. Actually lead to a lot of creativity, I think.
Yeah. Well, well, one doesn't wish it to happen, but there is this feeling that in these times of recession and so on, that actually a lot of creativity emerges. It's a pattern that happens over and over again, doesn't it?